Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to AI Era Islamic Abrahamic Wisdom. Today we're exploring a fascinating case from Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir's book, The Foundation of Islamic Jurisprudence, and we're focusing on the absolutely brilliant constitutional decisions of Hazrat Umar ibn al-Khattab. We're going to see how he tackled a problem that has brought down empires for thousands of years.
So think about it for a second. This is the ultimate question for any leader, right? How do you manage a huge area with tons of people without everything either falling apart into total chaos or becoming a brutal dictatorship? For the Islamic State in the 7th century, which was expanding at an unbelievable rate, this wasn't some theoretical question. It was a real, urgent crisis that needed an answer, and fast.
So here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we'll get a feel for just how massive the empire's challenge really was. Then, we're going to look at the 4 huge threats that could have brought the whole thing down. After that, we'll explore the really clever federal solution that was put in place. And finally, we'll zero in on the single core idea that made the whole thing work.
Okay, let's jump right in with the challenge itself. To really get why the solution was so genius, you first have to appreciate the sheer scale of the problem. We're not just talking about a bit of new land, we're talking about explosive, almost unimaginable growth.
Just let that sink in. In an incredibly short amount of time, the state grew to cover thousands of miles. It included all sorts of different cultures, different languages, and different ways of life. Trying to rule all of that directly from the capital, Madinah, it was completely impossible. You couldn't just send a rider and expect a quick response. This created a huge power vacuum, a constitutional black hole that had to be filled immediately.
Now here's what makes this story so incredible. Hazrat Umar didn't just see this as a big logistical problem, a management headache. He looked deeper and saw fundamental structural threats that could destroy the state from the inside out.
He diagnosed 4, that's right, 4 specific ways the entire project could just completely fall apart. 4 critical points of failure. Let's take a look at exactly what they were.
So let's break these down, because they're really important. First, administrative overstretch. How could one central government possibly know what's going on day to day in a town hundreds of miles away in Egypt? It just can't. Second, local tyranny. Okay, so you put a governor in charge of a faraway province. What's to stop him from basically becoming a little king and doing whatever he wants? Third, legal fragmentation. If every region just starts making up its own laws, then the whole idea of one community under one law just disappears. And finally, you have revenue and security drift. If a province controls its own money and its own army, what's to stop it from just saying, you know what, we're our own country now? And you've got to understand, these weren't just small bumps in the road. Not at all. Any one of these, if left unchecked, could have shattered the state into a million pieces. They were truly existential threats. The stakes were as high as they could possibly be.
So the big question is, how do you solve problems like these? Well, the obvious choice might be to grab even more power at the center, but that would just make the overstretch worse. The other choice is to let things go, but that leads to collapse. Hazrat Umar did neither. Instead, he came up with something new and brilliant, a federal-style framework.
And this right here is the heart of the whole idea, the provincial governance framework. It was designed to do 2 things that sound like they completely contradict each other. First, give local leaders real power to actually govern their regions effectively. But second, make sure they were always tied to and controlled by a central constitutional authority. It's an incredibly delicate and smart balancing act.
And here's how it looked in the real world. The massive empire was carved up into these more manageable provinces, or wilayats, like the ones you see here. Each one had its own local officials running the show day to day. But, and this is the absolute key, they all operated under the exact same constitutional rules, which came directly from the capital, Madinah. Now, it is so important to understand that this was not feudalism. In a feudal system, power is basically personal property. A local lord is born into it, he owns it, and he can do what he wants. This was the total opposite. Here, power was a trust, delegated to you. Officials were appointed by the central government. They had to follow a uniform, constitutional law, not just their own whims. Power wasn't something you owned. It was a responsibility you held.
Okay, so this brings us to the single most important takeaway, the one core principle, the secret sauce that made this entire amazing system work.
If you remember just one thing from our time today, make it this phrase: delegated governance under law. It just says it all perfectly. Delegated governance means you push power out to the local level where it's needed. But under law is the anchor. It means that power is always limited by the supreme authority of one central law that applies to everybody, no matter where they are.
And by striking that perfect balance, this framework just systematically dismantled all 4 of those constitutional threats we talked about earlier. It solved overstretch by empowering local leaders. It stopped tyranny by holding them accountable to the law. It prevented fragmentation by having one uniform code. And it stopped provinces from drifting away by keeping that central constitutional authority intact. It was a truly complete solution to a very complex set of problems.
So it leaves us with a pretty deep question for today, doesn't it? What can modern governments, or even big companies and small teams, learn from this 7th century model of balancing freedom with unity? What are those ancient principles of good governance that are still absolutely essential for any leader today? If you found this exploration insightful, please subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and please also share this video with your friends. Thank you so much for joining.
Think about it. It's the oldest question in politics, isn't it? How do you hand someone the keys to the kingdom without them locking everyone else out? For literally thousands of years, people have wrestled with this. How do you make sure that power serves the public, not just the powerful? Well, 14 centuries ago, a really remarkable solution was put to the test. So let's just picture the scene for a moment. We're in the early days of the Islamic Caliphate under its second leader, Umar bin al-Khattab, and this new state is just exploding in size. We're talking about new lands from Persia all the way to Egypt. Now, this isn't just about drawing new lines on a map, it's a massive, massive administrative headache. You've got all these different cultures, new languages, and huge distances separating the governors from the capital. The potential for corruption, for abuse of power, for a governor to become a mini dictator, it was enormous. So how did they solve this? We're going to break down Caliph Umar's incredible system. First, we'll look at the sheer scale of the problem. Then, we'll see how they literally wrote the book on power. After that, we'll explore how they prevented anyone from getting too much power, how they kept it all on a tight leash, and finally, what this all meant for the average person, the quest for justice for all. So, here's the core dilemma Caliph Umar was facing. He had to give his governors real authority. I mean, they needed to be able to maintain order, run the province, collect taxes. But how could he sit in Medina, hundreds, maybe thousands of miles away, and be sure they wouldn't just become petty tyrants, enriching themselves and abusing the very people they were supposed to serve? And this is where it gets really brilliant. He recognized that just picking good guys for the job wasn't going to cut it. You know, human nature being what it is, even the best person can be tempted by absolute power, especially when nobody's watching. What was needed wasn't just good people, but a good system. A robust, repeatable set of rules and institutions that would shape and constrain every single official, no matter who they were. So the very first part of this new system was to change what power even meant. It couldn't be this vague, personal thing based on who you are. No, it had to be defined, it had to be limited, and it had to be based on the law. And the core concept was this idea of delegated authority. Think about what this means. A governor's power was never, ever his own. It was on loan from the caliph, who held it on behalf of the people. It wasn't a right, it was a responsibility. And because it was delegated, it was also conditional. It was limited, and, crucially, it could be taken away at any time. They weren't owners of power, they were just stewards. This is a huge deal. I mean, for most of history, the ruler's will was the law. Here, we're seeing a massive shift towards the idea that the ruler is under the law. Government was becoming less about the personal whims of a strongman and more about an administration that had to follow the rules. And this wasn't just some abstract idea. They made it real with something that sounds incredibly modern, a written mandate for every governor. It was basically a job contract. As you can see, it laid out exactly what they could and couldn't do. It set spending limits, and this one is so important, it specifically forbade them from meddling in the courts. This piece of paper was the first legal link in the leash on their power. Okay, so defining power is one thing, but that's not enough, right? The next part of the architecture was just as crucial, making sure no single person could ever get their hands on all the levers of power in a province. The solution? A kind of early separation of powers. This table lays it out perfectly. In every province, you didn't just have a governor. You had at least 3 major officials. The governor, or the wali, handled the day-to-day administration and security. But, and this is the key, he had zero control over the courts or the money. Then you had the judge, the qadi. He was in charge of justice, and he operated totally independently. And finally, the treasury officer, who handled all the finances and reported directly back to the central government in Medina, not to the local governor. The genius of this setup is that it created checks and balances on purpose. A governor couldn't use his army to pressure a judge. He couldn't just dip into the treasury to fund a personal project. Power was being checked by other power. It was a deliberate strategy to make it structurally impossible for one person to become an autocrat. So, you've defined power and you've separated it. Great. But how do you really make sure everyone is doing their job? Well, this brings us to the very heart of the system, what we're calling power with a leash. This wasn't just one thing. It was a whole network of accountability, a multi-layered system that constantly watched every official. And this was a very deliberate design. It had 4 clear pillars, each one reinforcing the others to create this really tight web of oversight. It's an incredible thing to see in action, so let's break down each one. Pillar number 1, financial transparency. It's simple, but it's so powerful. Before a governor even started his job, a complete list of everything he owned was put on record. Then, when he left office, they checked again. Any new wealth that couldn't be explained was considered suspect, investigated, and if it was gained illegally, it was taken and put right back into the public treasury. It was a brilliant, straightforward way to fight corruption. Now this one is just revolutionary. They empowered the public. Any regular citizen from the farthest corner of the empire had the right to travel to the capital and file a complaint directly against their governor. This wasn't some suggestion box that gets ignored. These complaints triggered real, formal investigations. It sent a powerful message. The government answers to you, the people. And the system didn't just sit back and wait for complaints to roll in. It was proactive. Caliph Umar had a special department of investigators, men who were legendary for their integrity, like Muhammad ibn Maslama. You could think of them as his internal affairs department. They'd travel to the provinces, sometimes undercover, to conduct surprise audits and report back on how things were really going. And then there was the grand finale of accountability. Every single year, during the annual pilgrimage, the Hajj, every governor had to show up in Makkah. And there, in front of a huge public crowd, they had to stand before the caliph and the people and give an account of their entire year in office. Any citizen could stand up and question them directly. Can you imagine a more powerful ritual of transparency? So the crucial point here is that this wasn't about having no authority. The governors had real power to get things done. But that power was never, ever unchecked. It was constantly being watched, questioned, audited, and reviewed, from the top down, from the bottom up, and from within. So you have this incredibly complex system of checks and balances. What's the end goal? What does all this machinery actually produce? Well, it all funnels down to one thing: the ability to provide a fair and consistent standard of justice for everyone across this incredibly diverse land. The system created a common legal playing field that applied everywhere. It didn't matter if you were in Egypt or Syria, the judicial process was standardized. The tax rules were consistent and fair. And most importantly, the law offered equal protection to every citizen, whether they were Muslim or not, Arab or not. But here's the really sophisticated part. This wasn't about steamrolling local cultures. The administration understood that you had to respect local identity, so local customs, traditions, even local laws were allowed to continue, with one big condition. They could not violate the core principles of justice. Fairness was the one red line that could not be crossed. This slide really gets to the heart of that delicate balancing act. On one side, you let people keep their cultural practices and traditions, but on the other, these core ideas of fairness, of equity, of protection under the law, those were universal and non-negotiable. It wasn't about forcing people to choose. It was about creating a framework where you could have both. And the result was profound. It built a sense of unity based on a shared promise of justice, without demanding that everyone give up who they were. It was a formula for holding a massive, multicultural state together, not just with military might, but with fairness. So when we step back and look at this entire incredible system from the 7th century, what's the blueprint? What are the big lessons we can pull from it? It really seems to boil down to these 4 big ideas. First, that authority is a public trust. It has to be defined, delegated, and limited. Second, you have to separate power, because concentrated power is almost always abused. Third, you have to weave accountability into the very fabric of government. It can't be an afterthought. And finally, justice has to be for everyone, while still making room for diversity. In the end, this entire intricate structure comes right back to that central idea we started with. It was a system of power with a leash. It gave officials enough rope to do their jobs, but it kept that rope tightly tethered to the principles of justice, transparency, and above all, service to the people. And that really leaves us with a final question to think about. When we look at all the challenges our own governments face today, corruption, abuse of power, the feeling that the system isn't fair, you have to wonder, are these principles, developed 1,400 years ago, still the essential blueprint for a government that truly works for its people? Something to think about. Thanks for fundamental question. A challenge that is absolutely timeless. When a state gets bigger, when it expands, the leader at the center just can't manage everything, right? You have to delegate power to governors in far-off provinces. But here's the massive risk. How do you stop those governors from getting corrupt, from building their own little kingdoms, and eventually just breaking away? How do you keep it all together without the center becoming a tyranny? Well, this was the exact problem that Hazrat Umar was staring down. The early Islamic State was growing at an incredible pace, and he desperately needed a system to manage it all, not just effectively, but justly. And his solution, well, it wasn't just a list of rules. It was this comprehensive framework, a true masterclass in administration that was all about balancing local freedom with central integrity.
Okay, so let's really dive into how he did it. The entire structure, the whole shebang, rested on 3 pillars that were all connected. You can think of it like a 3-legged stool. You control the money, you control the military, and you control the political mandate, the right to rule. If any one of those legs gets weak, the whole thing just topples over. Let's break down each one.
The first pillar was all about the money. The system he set up is something we'd now call fiscal federalism. Basically, provincial governments were empowered to collect taxes and spend that money on local needs, salaries, roads, public services. But, and this is a huge but, only within limits that were authorized by the central government. So they had freedom, they had autonomy, but they did not have a blank check. What's so fascinating here is just how proactive these rules were. By making it a law that all surplus cash had to be sent back to the central treasury, the Beit al-Mal, the system basically solved huge problems before they could even start. It meant rich provinces couldn't just sit on piles of gold. It meant a governor couldn't threaten to cut off funds to blackmail the capital. And maybe most importantly, it allowed the central government to take that surplus and redistribute it to poorer provinces, making sure everyone got a fair shake. So, you see, the crucial point here is that this was way more than just a tax collection agency. It was this really sophisticated financial network built on clear responsibilities and, critically, accountability. And that word is key, because this system actually included audits. The central government didn't just trust the provinces, to be honest, it verified the books. That is a remarkably modern way to think about public money.
All right, let's move on to that second pillar, military power. Now, this is where the framework gets really brilliant. It makes a sharp distinction. Day-to-day local security, stuff we might call policing today, that was handled by the local provincial government. But the real military might, the authority to wage war, the power to appoint top generals, all of that was kept firmly in the hands of the central state. No exceptions.
And this just perfectly illustrates the core principle. You have to separate local administration from national military power. A provincial governor couldn't just wake up one day and decide to raise his own private army to challenge the capital. On top of that, by setting up these garrison cities, these military hubs that were loyal directly to the state, Hazrat Umar could project power and put down threats fast, without turning every single province into a military base. It was a genius move to prevent the rise of regional warlords. And what was the result of all this? A unified military that served the state and its laws, not the personal ambitions of some powerful guy. The army's loyalty was to the central government, making sure that might was always serving what was right. I mean, this is the very essence of civilian oversight of the military, a concept that is absolutely fundamental to stable governments all over the world today. Now for the third and final pillar, political accountability. And honestly, this might just be the most revolutionary one of all. In this system, being a governor wasn't a lifetime job. It wasn't a prize you won. It was a position of public service, a secret trust. These leaders were understood to be appointed officials, not kings. And believe me, they were constantly being watched. Let me give you a quick story to show you just how profound this was. There was a famous and successful governor named Saad ibn Abi Waqqas. He was a hero, a celebrated companion of the Prophet. But complaints started coming in from the people he governed that he was living too lavishly. And just the perception of arrogance, the fact that public trust was starting to weaken, that was enough. He was recalled and investigated. Can you imagine the message that sent? Your performance means nothing if you lose your integrity. And that story perfectly illustrates this incredibly powerful ethical standard. A leader's moral standing and the public's trust in them were actually more important than their administrative wins. Simply getting the job done was never, ever an excuse for arrogance, for excess,
or for losing the faith of the people you served. Justice and humility were completely non-negotiable. Okay, so let's step back for a second and see how all this builds into a blueprint that is shockingly familiar. When you look at these three pillars working together, the fiscal control, the centralized military, and the political accountability, what you're really looking at are the core principles of modern constitutional government. This slide right here, this is the key connection. Delegating authority for local matters, that's what we now call federal administration. Centralized command of the military, a cornerstone of civilian oversight. And that whole system of rotation, review, and removal, that is a powerful, powerful form of political checks and balances. These aren't 20th century ideas. The concepts were being put into practice 1,400 years ago. It's incredible. And what makes this all the more remarkable is that this entire complex system wasn't enforced by some long, detailed written constitution. It was held together by a set of deeply ingrained principles and shared cultural values. The commitment to justice, to humility, to accountability, that was the binding norm, a social contract that everyone understood was even stronger than any law written on a piece of paper. So why does any of this ancient history actually matter to us right now? Because so many countries today are still fighting these exact same battles. They struggle with central governments that try to control everything and end up being inefficient. They worry about provinces trying to rebel or break away. They fight corruption from local elites who are stealing public money. And they wrestle with this problem of uneven development, where the capital city gets everything and the countryside gets left behind. Hazrat Umar's framework gives us a clear 4-step blueprint. First, delegate power. Absolutely, but define its limits very clearly. Second, decentralize the tasks of government, but never, ever decentralize ultimate sovereignty. Third, constantly audit and review everyone who holds power. And fourth, make sure the standard of justice is exactly the same for everybody, everywhere, from the palace in the capital to the smallest village. So, after all that, what's the ultimate takeaway here? What's the big idea that holds this entire sophisticated system of governance together? Well, it's a powerful vision for how you achieve unity without having to resort to tyranny. What this framework achieved was pretty extraordinary. It built and managed a massive state that stretched across continents. And it did it without relying on the absolute, unchecked power of emperors or hereditary princes. Yes, there was authority, but it was conditional. It was based on service, on justice, and on public trust, not on who your father was or how big your army was. And this quote just brilliantly captures the core philosophy. Real, sustainable state power doesn't come from a paranoid center trying to control every little thing. It comes from a trusted, accountable, and distributed system where power is delegated in a smart, disciplined way. It's strength that's built on trust and systems, not on fear and personality. Ultimately, this principled foundation, this commitment to justice and accountability, was what allowed the state to expand in a way that wasn't just about territory, but was also ethical. It gave it a moral compass, a set of binding rules that ensured that as it grew bigger and more powerful, it didn't lose the very principles it was founded on. It could grow, in other words, without losing its soul. Now, these principles of good governance didn't just stop at the provincial level. So join us for our next explainer, where we're going to explore another one of Hazrat Umar's truly radical ideas, his systematic approach to ending nepotism, and making sure that competence, not your connections, not your tribe, was the supreme law for anyone holding public office.